So there might be good reasons to be a dynamist that are completely distinct from any of these kinds of considerations that appeal to our sort of lived experience. I certainly grant that. So, and dynamism might be true for all that I've said, but the claim is just there's not a powerful argument to that conclusion based on any of these kinds of experiential sort of claims.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Kristie Miller. She is the Challis Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Time. Her work has focused on metaphysics, especially as it relates to time, temporal passage, identity, and agency. Her books include, among some others, issues in theoretical diversity, persistence, composition, and time, persistence, the normative status of time bias. That's actually going to come up a little bit today as well. Empirically led investigation. And her new book, Life in Four Dimensions, A Defense of Block Universe Theory. That last book will be our focus for today. But yeah, feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Miller.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Sweet. So there's going to be a lot to discuss here. And as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your new book, and I'll provide links to where people can find that once it's available. It's called Life in Four Dimensions, Defense of the Block Universe Theory. So just to begin, can you explain what the block universe theory is and maybe contrast it with other views?
So one way of thinking of the block universe view is, roughly speaking, as the view that all the events and objects and properties that ever do exist in the past, what we might think of as past, present, and future, just simply do exist. So a natural way to kind of think about that is, and I guess the reason people call it a block universe, is to sort of imagine what the universe looks like if you were to somehow step outside space and time itself. Now, of course, this is a kind of a useful heuristic. No one thinks that that's a thing that we can do. But the thought here is that what you would see is a whole big block of events. And it would include the three spatial dimensions that we're all very familiar with, as well as one dimension, which would be the temporal dimension. And so the image you would have is of all of the events going back, let's suppose our universe started with a big bang, and let's suppose that it ends with a big crunch. Doesn't really matter. But the idea is that the universe is a block insofar as all of those events, all the way from the big bang to the big crunch, they're all there in that block of events. So events that you're experiencing now, plus yesterday's events, plus tomorrow's events, they're all equally real. They're all laid out in space-time, if you will. And so in some sense, it's right to say that nothing comes into or passes out of existence because, of course, what exists yesterday is always existing there yesterday. Now, that might sound a bit mysterious, so perhaps it does help to kind of compare that to some other sort of view. So there are lots of alternative views on that one can avail oneself of, but mostly those are views on which, at least in some good sense, things are coming into or passing from existence, or in some way changing whether they are really present. So some views are ones on which the only things that exist are the things that are existing right now. So that's you and me and my dog snoozing here on the couch, but it doesn't include dinosaurs and big bangs, and it doesn't include all of the various future things that might happen. So that's a view known as presentism. And notice that what's going to be important about that view is that although all that exists are the things now, obviously presentists want to say that what exists changes, right? Because they don't think that our world is kind of frozen and the only thing that ever exists is you, me, the dogs, and the various other things that exist now. They want to say that what exists changes, so that as time passes, different things are existing at, as of the present moment. So that's one view, and people often talk about that as a kind of dynamical view. And what's dynamical about it is just that things are coming into and passing from existence, and time is really passing because which things are present is changing. And there's other ways that you can capture that same sort of idea without being committed to that particular ontology. But all of these views are going to be ones in which there's some genuine fact of the matter about which things really are present, and there's going to be some genuine fact of the matter about which things really are past and which things really are future, although different views might disagree about whether those things exist or not. that contrasts with the block universe view on which all of the things simply exist and there's no facts at all about which things really are present. So presentness is just sort of wherever you happen to be, very much like your spatial location is just wherever you happen to be. And they're all equally real. And there's nothing special about where you and I happen to be. Just likewise, there's nothing special about temporally where we happen to be. And that's the sense in which the view is kind of non-dynamical, because time isn't really passing. There's no change in which things are really present. There's no change in which things really exist. Everything's just there, bing, bang, boom, as it were.
Okay, good. Yeah. So one way, the sort of incomplete metaphor that I found sort of helpful for thinking about the distinction here is like, you can imagine the block universe kind of like a loaf of bread, and sort of the slices being analogous to sort of time slices in reality. But what exists in some sense is the whole loaf. Whereas on, say, a presentist view, what exists in a way changes. You only have a slice at a time, so to speak, but you never have the full loaf. Now, obviously that's a imperfect metaphor, but maybe that sort of helps to get some of the idea there between a more eternalist and a present, or a block universe and a presentist view. And on the presentist view, so described, there's really these genuine facts about which slice is really the present one, because there is only one that is the present one. That's not just some perspectival thing or something like that. And time is flowing in some sense, or there's really this dynamic aspect to time that you don't get on a block universe. It's just a sort of, in some sense, a static thing. Although there are different times, things can be before then or later than others. There's not this genuine temporal becoming or something else like that we might associate with a dynamical view. Does that all sound right? That seems a fair description to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the loaf metaphor is nice. Yeah, so you're absolutely right that in the block view you've got the whole loaf, and the loaf itself isn't changing. It's just there is the loaf. Whereas on other views you've got different bits of the loaf. So as you put it, yeah. So in the presentist case, you've literally got one slice, but a very, very thin slice, right? Don't imagine that you're cutting your loaf up very thickly. You've got a tiny slice that has no temporal width, but then which slice exists effectively changes. But of course, there are other views on which other components of your loaf exist. So like on a growing block model, it's literally a growing loaf. So you start off with a single slice. So it's sort of like, you can imagine that this is not an optimal way of buying bread, but when you first get your bread, there's like a little one slice there. But as time goes by, instead of the loaf getting smaller, which is what normally happens with loaf, instead it grows. So effectively on that view, time's passing is sort of captured by the fact that the loaf is growing, and more stuff. I mean, in terms of loaves, that sounds weird, but when you think about it in terms of time, it sounds less odd. So it's the view basically that, new stuff is constantly coming into existence. So the past is sort of out there. All the things that have happened are out there in space-time, which is not an unintuitive view. But of course, the view is like the future hasn't happened yet. So what it is for the future to happen is for new things to come into existence, things that, and of course, when they come into existence, they are in the present moment, because the present moment just is the last time at which stuff comes into existence. So it's sort of it's the very last slice of the loaf, effectively. But then, of course, another slice gets added, and the slice that was present ceases to be so because there's another slice that's, grown in front of it. So these are, and of course, there's myriad other possible views you could have about like which bit of the loaf there is and how it is that the loaf is changing. But all of those views are kind of contrast with with the idea that you've got just one unchanging loaf.
Right. Yeah, that growing block theory is in certain ways very different from presentism, because it's aside from the initial moment, so to speak, there's, what exists is temporally extended in a way. There's many times that exist objectively, but nevertheless, there's still a sort of objective present, and things are changing in this dynamical way that you don't get on the block theory. Yeah. And we can come back to that and other views as well, like the moving spotlight theory and so on. I guess you could even have a shrinking block. That's maybe even more an unintuitive view.
But yes, it is the inverse in some ways of the growing block.
Right. So yeah, maybe at this point, now that we have some of the basic positions or views on the table, could you give a bit of an overview of the book? Sort of what considerations do you consider, and like what's your general approach or like methodology for approaching these issues?
Yeah, so when I started writing the book, what I didn't want to do so much is give a whole bunch of arguments in favor of why we should endorse the block view, or indeed really in some sense why even arguments against why we shouldn't endorse some kind of dynamical view. Not because I don't think there are such arguments, but because I wasn't sure that I had much to add to what's already been said, either in favor of the block view or against the dynamical view. So what I was more interested in is, I guess in the last few decades, there's been a kind of a sort of argument that has been mounted, what you might think of as an objection to the block view, which more or less takes the form of maybe it concedes to the block theorist that the block view has a lot of good-making features, it fits very well with science and so forth. But the general form of the objection is something like the idea that the way we experience the world in a kind of first personal way, in a whole bunch of different kinds of ways, just doesn't match up to our world being a block. And so there's different ways you might try and push that objection. But it seems like even the weakest form of the objection is something like a challenge to the block view, a kind of explanatory challenge, which is, look, if you guys are right and our world really is the way that you claim it is, how on earth could it be that we experience the world the way we do, given that, according to the objection, we do not experience as being this kind of block view? So that's one way you might think of the challenge. And then there are stronger versions of it, according to which it's not just a kind of explanatory challenge to stump up and tell some story about how it could be that the world seems the way it is. It's a sort of stronger claim, which is that we simply cannot make any sense at all of the way the world seems to us if our world were a block world. And in either of these cases, obviously the dialectical force is supposed to be to get us to move to some other view, because the idea is that either the best way or maybe even the only way to make sense of our various experiences of the world is to think that our world is dynamical in some way, or at least that our world isn't a block. And then that's a very basic form of the objection, and that's really the idea that the book takes up throughout. And then it's really just structured in terms of which kind of experience it is that we're worried about, because people have been worried about lots of different kinds of ways of experiencing the world that seem to them, at least, to be inconsistent with our world being a block, or at least difficult to explain. And what that argument looks like obviously looks very different depending on which aspect of experience you think is the problematic one. So the book just takes up different aspects of the experience in different chapters and tries to show that there isn't really a problem here, that it's not there's a number of different possible ways of responding to that kind of objection. And obviously one way is to provide an explanation. It's to say something like, yes, you're right, the world really does seem the way that you claim that it seems, and I see that on the face of it that kind of doesn't seem like what you would expect if our world were a block world, but here's the explanation for why our world really does seem that way regardless. Mostly that's not the strategy that I wanted to go with in this book. Mostly I wanted to go with a strategy that says something like, look, block theorists have just been too conciliatory. They've kind of they've let go of they've given to their opponent the idea that we have all of these temporal experiences and other kinds of experiences which suggest that our world isn't a block. And I'm just not at all sure that that's true to begin with. So a certain amount of the book is kind of focusing on that idea and trying to maybe backpedal a little bit to kind of take back some of what we've given to the objector here and say, look, this claim that we have experiences and that those experiences suggest our world isn't a block, that's not true to begin with.
Good. Yeah. And there's a significant focus on sort of experimental work and survey results and stuff like that. And we can get into some of those results where relevant, but yeah, maybe could you talk a little bit about that and how it's important and how you approach that in this book and
Yeah. So I mean, it's relatively unusual for philosophers to do experimental work. It's certainly not unheard of. There is a kind of burgeoning area of experimental philosophy which aims to try and kind of empirically test various claims, and it's still, I think, very controversial exactly what the value of that is. I'm not unskeptical. I feel like that's probably not a word. I share some skepticism about what the value of that is. I think sometimes it's unclear what that is bringing to the table philosophy-wise. And I think there's a general worry that people have about experimental stuff, which goes something like, look, when we're thinking about time and metaphysics more generally, what we care about is like, what is the world really like, right? So we're kind of interested in articulating the genuine way the world is, and we're not so much interested in how people think the world is. I mean, that might be a really interesting question in psychology, like how do people think about the world, but like that's not metaphysics. And there could be a huge gap between what people think the world is like and what the world is in fact like. And so on the face of it, there's potentially an issue here where someone might think, look, what you're trying to do is metaphysics. I just don't understand why you would ask the man on the street, or many men and women on the street, what they think about these things, because how on earth could that tell you anything about what the world is in fact like? So, and I think that's a entirely legitimate worry to have across a bunch of fields where we're worrying about experimental work. So I guess the thing to say in this case is, this particular objection is precisely meant to be leveraging some purported gap between the way the world seems to people and the way that it is. So the very objection goes via the claim that people have certain sorts of beliefs about the world, or they experience the world kind of perceptually in some way, or they have certain kinds of seemings, or they have certain kinds of attitudes or practices, and that somehow there's a misalignment between some or all of those things and the way the world would be if the world were in fact a block. So that first claim about the way the world seems, or the way people believe the world to be, or the attitudes people actually have, or the practices people have, those are all empirical claims about like what we are like psychologically speaking in some sort of way. So in order to figure out like what we should be doing here, so obviously there's one project of saying, yes, we really are like that, and what we need to be doing as block theorists is explaining why we are creatures like that, given that our world is a block. That's one explanatory project. But of course, that explanatory project only makes good sense if we really are like that. If we're not like that, if we're some different way, then obviously one ought not to be trying to explain the fact that we're like that, because we're not. So this is a place where I do think some experimental methods are valuable, because whenever you have empirical claims about what people are like, what they believe, what they experience, it seems that the obvious and best way to test this is empirically. So obviously you can start off, prior to having any ability to do empirical work, a very natural thing is to consult your own seemings and your own experiences and your own beliefs, and chatting to all your friends and other philosophers. Like, this is a totally legitimate first place to start, because after all, you are a person and your friends are people and philosophers are people. So that's a sample of people. But that's obviously not in general the way we want to try and gather data about like what people are like psychologically. We don't expect psychology departments to just like consult their own intuitions about themselves and their colleagues. So I think we can do better in terms of probing these things, and that's what this kind of experimental work is doing. So it is not intended to directly shed light on what the world is like. It is intended to shed light on what we are like, and it does seem like that is a good place to do experimental work. And I think there's a lot of scope for different kind of experimental work. So if I were a psychologist and I had really like a really cool lab and like lots of participants like who were like right there in the flesh and blood, there's all sorts of additional cool experimental work that one could undertake that goes well beyond the sort of survey work that I in fact do in this book. But this is at least a good start. You have to start somewhere, and low-hanging fruit is generally the best place to start.
Good. Yeah. So I did recently talk with Mark Balaguer on his new book concerning presentism, and one of the things he discussed in there was that he's open to the possibility that like our everyday temporal thought and talk was kind of messy and variable, and it might not be that when people report their temporal beliefs or intuitions that they're always substantively disagreeing with each other. And when So he is sort of the view that at least when theorizing about time, maybe it's not so important to focus on everyday or folk temporal concepts and beliefs and intuitions. And indeed, he's not even concerned with consulting whether people have this, what their temporal phenomenology is like so much, and partly for those reasons. But when theorizing about time, he wants to think, well, let's develop these maybe more substantive or clear ways to think about it. Adopts this language he calls substantialese. And then we can go on from there and look at the physics and do some theorizing and so on. We don't have to be super connected to our folk or everyday temporal thought and talk. And that's a sort of brief way to put it. But yeah, what do you make of this sort of response for thinking that, maybe there's something interesting to be gleaned from the experimental work, and it might reveal something interesting about us. But for theorizing about time and some of the motivations for and against different views about time, maybe it's not that important. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I think that's completely legitimate. So I think whether those things are important is entirely going to depend on what's motivating you towards one theory or another, right? So there's a completely legitimate project which says, look, the reason to be motivated towards, say, a dynamical view as opposed to a block view has nothing to do with how the world seems to us. It has nothing to do with whether we claim to experience time as flowing. It has nothing to do with sort of temporal beliefs or temporal attitudes. Instead, there are a bunch of other sorts of arguments against or in favor of various different kinds of views. And those are the only things that I think can play a sort of legitimate role in theorizing. So I think if you come to the debate with that, so you think, you might think either, look, I don't know how people, I don't know what people's temporal experiences are like, and what's more, I don't think there's an easy way to find out, and so that just shouldn't be an input to theorizing. Or you might think, look, I don't care what they're like because they're just not a good way of theorizing, getting to, views about the world. Then I think, none of these, most of what I am kind of interested in this book turns out to not be relevant. And I think that's a perfectly good avenue. So you might be interested in arguments for the block universe that just focus on, for instance, arguments from physics, right? And nothing to do with how anyone experiences anything. You might be interested in arguments for, say, presentism, which just focus on the fact that it is more ontologically parsimonious because you're not positing past and future. These all things, I definitely do not want to suggest that these are not perfectly legitimate things to do. I guess the purpose of this book is just to engage with people who do think, as a matter of fact, that one of the most potent arguments in favor of dynamism and against the block theory is some kind of argument that proceeds via thinking about the way the world seems. And now Mark might not be that person, right? None of the arguments he marshals might appeal to those things, in which case I'm in no way responding to what he says in that book. But there certainly are a bunch of people who think that a very important motivation for dynamism is something about kind of temporal seemings. So this book is really targeted at them, whether they are dynamists or whether they're block theorists trying to respond to dynamists. I really don't have anything to say in this book about other sorts of arguments that you might have one way or another. So I don't try and take a stand on whether arguments from physics are really good and decisive arguments in favor of the block view. I mean, I have a view about that, but the book doesn't take any stand on that. I don't take any stand on whether there are arguments like from parsimony for something like presentism. So there's an absolute ton of other arguments out there, which Mark is quite right, have nothing to do at all with either temporal experience or temporal belief or temporal attitudes. So this is a small part of the literature, but I do think that historically people have been either explicitly or implicitly very motivated by temporal experience to develop dynamical theories. So I think it's an important area of the literature.
Good. And I did also want to bring up a sort of methodological concern for doing this experimental work, because a few years ago I talked with, in a totally different domain, Lance Bush, who has done some work on experimental sort of metaethics or folk metaethics. And one of the things he's found there, or has argued there, is that the work is sort of very hard to do, because in part because, well, not just because people are prone to misinterpret questions and that sort of thing. But like part of the problem is that, well, one of the issues, for example, is if you're trying to figure out whether people have a sort of implicit commitment to objective moral facts, for example. Well, when you start explaining these notions to people or explaining cases in a way that would, help them to give an answer that would be illuminating about their actual position or commitments, it might be that you're turning them into sort of mini philosophers in a way where they start to develop views that they otherwise wouldn't have had or committed to. And it's not obvious that there's a way to do this and without doing that, right, to get the understanding of their actual commitments as they are. And there's other worries about the experimental methodology along these lines where it's just not easy to do and to trust the results that we get. Do you worry about some of these sorts of concerns in these cases, or what do you think, or how do you mitigate some of the worries, experimental worries that inevitably come up?
Yeah, no, I think those are legitimate concerns, and I think that's going to be true in most areas where philosophers are trying to do work like this. And it might even be in some ways more pressing here, partly because we're evolved creatures who maybe we don't spend a lot of time thinking about like whether there are objective moral facts in the sort of way that philosophers think. But people certainly have very robust kind of moral intuitions about cases, right? In a way that it's not very clear they have kind of robust intuitions about like the nature of temporality, because that's not the kind of thing like, you can see why social creatures evolved to have moral intuitions. It's not very obvious why people would evolve to have these fine-grained kind of metaphysical views. So I think in some ways, the problem is more pressing in the temporal case. And likewise that, you almost put it as a dilemma, right? So either you ask people questions, but they don't really understand what you're asking them because you haven't explained it. And then obviously that's a problem. Or you explain a bunch of distinctions, but then there's a genuine concern that you've changed what's going on for them in certain kinds of ways and you've made them think various things. And if that's all of the possibility space, then you're in trouble. So I think those are very completely legitimate worries that I also have. I guess I don't really think that people ambulate, around in the world with robust metaphysical views that you can just kind of suck out from them by asking them things. What I guess I do think is, in the case of temporal experience, there's amongst many, not all, maybe not Mark, but many temporal dynamists, there is a sort of claim that people have an overwhelming, obvious, clear sense feeling of time passing. So there is a thing that they are suggesting there, which is not simply that there's a kind of vague, indeterminate, unclear, messy thing that people have. I think in the case of temporal experience, what has been suggested is that when you see the various, quotes that people offer, is that it's overwhelming and obvious and forceful and universal and at all times that it seems to us as though this is the objectively privileged moment and future moments are coming or events are coming towards us and then receding into the past. So I think there is a case to be made in that case that even if it turns out that people's experiences are much more messy than that, that already goes towards undermining that claim that that there is this kind of strong and overwhelming sense. And there is a hope that you can probe that by asking people relatively straightforward sorts of things about how things seem to them. Now, of course, there's always a danger in experimental work that people will acquiesce to whatever you're asking or that you change things in various ways. But one would hope that when people are having overwhelming experiences all the time, that there would be a way of, it would be straightforward for them to articulate that is the way things seem to them. I think things get much more messy when you're talking about what they believe about sort of the way time works, because that's much less a sense that every moment of every day they're having this overwhelming sense of time passing, right? That doesn't seem right. It seems like that's a much more cognitive and theorized sort of thing to be trying to target. And what's more, I think it's very unlikely that people have a well-articulated, determinate, clear picture in mind that they are using. But I do think there's something we can do here. So I think there is a sense that philosophers have that the dynamical view is in some sense a kind of toy tacit model that people are using. So not that they have a kind of super clearly articulated metaphysical model, but that they are at least ambulating in the world with some sense that there's something special about the moment that they're in. They might have views that there are genuine facts about like which things really are past and genuine facts about like which things are future. They might think that that people have a very clear tacit sense that, future things are still open and undecided and can be made different in various ways. So I think the best we can do in that regard is what we do whenever we're trying to probe kind of tacit ways that people, a kind of tacit theory that someone has, which is not necessarily something they've ever explicitly brought to mind. They've never kind of thought to themselves, oh, this is how I take the world to be, but nevertheless is a kind of model that guides their reasoning and behavior in various ways. And the only way we can sort of do that is to give people scenarios or describe various things and ask them various questions, like ask them to sort of use, in the ordinary way of going about in the world, what we're doing is using a kind of tacit theory to ambulate in the world. And so what you want to do when you're experimentally testing stuff, I guess, is in an experimental setting, getting people to kind of use that way of being in the world to answer questions about how they take the world to be. And so there's not intended to be a suggestion that when people answer those questions, they are articulating something that is already a well-formed, conscious, explicit theory in their minds, but rather that you're probing something that they've been using this whole time to kind of get around some kind of tacit thing. So I want to concede that none of this is ideal, right? Science is kind of not ideal in lots of ways. Any experimental work is like this, and there's plenty of ways in which things can go awry, which is why I think ideally you want lots of different ways of kind of trying to probe how people are tacitly thinking about or interacting with the world. You want as many different ways of doing this, using different methods, different vignettes. But I think there's still a hope that we can get something out of that we can find something about the ways that people are implicitly thinking about things.
Right. Yeah. One more quick worry about experimental methodology. There is also the worry that there's going to be some sampling bias. The samples are mostly people in the US and UK, if I recall correctly. And there's this worry that, is that representative of people generally? Is that a sort of weird demographic? We'll talk about Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic populations. And there may be reason to think that, or at least be suspicious that that's not representative of people generally. This is something you discuss a little bit in the book, but how do you feel about the worry that there's a sampling bias here?
Yeah, so I think that's a legitimate concern, and I think it would be really nice in future work to do more kind of cross-cultural work, and I have a little bit of that on the go at the moment. But yeah, so I certainly want to concede that is a limitation. I guess the two things I would want to say is that, so first of all, when it comes to sort of temporal experiences, like the sort of the pure seemings about how things are, I'd be surprised if those varied a lot kind of cross-culturally, because it seems to me that's a pretty low-level sort of perceptual system that's doing that sort of work. So it would be amazing if it was true, but I'd be super surprised if for instance, it didn't seem to people in the UK as though kind of time passes, but it did seem to people in Japan as though time passes in that kind of sense. So it's possible, and I certainly haven't ruled it out. I think that's an unlikely thing to discover. Even if one were to discover that, though, that would still, in a way, that would still be, I take it, a sort of problem for the people who are putting forward this kind of objection to the block view, right? Because after all, their position is something like, there's this overwhelming universal experience that everyone has that is incompatible with our world being a block. Now, if it turned out that some people in the world do report having that and some people don't report having that, that would be really interesting. But it would already erode some of the force of that objection, because it would no longer be true that there's this kind of universal experience that everyone overwhelmingly has. And already the explanatory target would be shifted a lot, because once you have that kind of variation, then you have to think, well, hang on, what really does need explaining here? And is it true anymore that our world being a block is not a good explanation for that? So in a way, I think that even finding out stuff about the populations we do test goes a long way towards responding to some of these objections. In the case of people's sort of implicit beliefs and theories and practices, you might expect them to be a bit more variable, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. But I think that that's already a case where it's not so obvious what you should infer about the world on the basis of people's sort of tacit theories. So I think it would be super interesting if everyone in the world had a sort of tacit dynamical theory. That would be really interesting. And then that would be really interesting to see what should the block theorist say about that. But I actually think that would be very surprising. And I don't think that that's not what we have evidence for, even in the populations we have tested. So I would predict some cross-cultural variation there. But again, I think that already puts some pressure on this objection, which says that the way people conceptualize the world is in this dynamical way. And I think it maybe also further undermines that sense, because after all, the people making those objections are coming from the US and the UK. So they are reporting their own experiences and beliefs and those of the people around them predominantly. So if what they say isn't even true of those, like of the people whose experiences they take themselves to be reporting, that is important in itself, albeit that it does leave open that there are other populations who are the way that that those philosophers claim. But there's no reason at this point to think that that's true, right? So this would still significantly undermine the objection, I guess. It would be an odd objection for someone in the UK to say, well, for all, like, look, I grant you that around here in the UK and the US, people don't experience time as passing and they don't have a kind of implicit view of time as dynamical and so forth. But look, for all we know, in Japan, people might, right? That is a very weak objection. Like, it's true. You're absolutely right. For all we know, that's true. But there's no good reason to posit that there's no independent motivation. So, again, I guess we do the best we can with the current resources to hand. And I think that goes potentially, depending on what the results of that are, it can go a long way towards undermining that objection, precisely because they're meant to be, I guess the thing that's going on with the dynamist is that they are trying to motivate the idea that, look, roughly speaking, all relatively well-functioning humans are kind of experiencing time as moving, and they have a kind of tacit view of time as dynamical, and they have these temporal attitudes that only make sense if time is dynamical. And of course, they can accommodate there being a small amount of variation, because of course, things can happen to people. But it's really antithetical to that general motivation to think that there's going to be huge amounts of cross-cultural variation, right? Because that just doesn't gel well with what's motivating their view. So in a way, it looks like you only need to sample some populations, because their claims are not claims that are easily reconfigured as ones in which there's a lot of cultural variation, because they really are positing that creatures like us have these kind of robust dynamical experiences. They're not saying something like some of us in some cultural situations will sometimes have things that are sometimes like this, right? And that would be much more difficult to test.
Yeah, no, those are some good points. I suspect that they would rather say that no, the people in these populations do almost universally have the relevant sorts of phenomenology and beliefs and so on. It's just that, I don't know, the experiments have sort of misidentified what their actual attitudes are or something like that.
Right.
So I think they'd rather, I suspect they'd be sooner attacking the results with the methodology than just granting it, but say, well, okay, maybe that's true, but like maybe there's a more general tendency towards dynamical views and commitments elsewhere in the world. I guess I could say that, but that seems like a less plausible view.
Yeah, so I think the right thing for them to say, if there were cross-cultural variation found, I think the right thing to say would be, no, the experiences and tacit beliefs are largely the same, but somehow some features of the cultural context or the reporting context are in some cultures leading to sort of false misreported data in some sense. Yeah, so I think that's right. Of course, the more you get in, so that is definitely Australia. I mean, we don't know that there is cross-cultural variation, but I think that is the right thing for them to say, and maybe that's also the right thing to say within populations. So the only real data we have is within sort of UK and US populations, where we do find a certain amount of variation. And I think you're right that the thing that they should say is not, yes, there is variation, certainly not at the level of the way the world seems to us. Maybe they could allow that there's variation in like tacit beliefs. I think you're right that what they should say is that somehow unanimity in experience is being misreported in the experiments in some way. And that's certainly something I consider in the book. And there are various ways that you might kind of pursue that avenue. Again, so I consider some of those and talk through those options. I guess one thing that I would say is that the more we get into the kind of nitty gritty here, the more there is, whatever you say about how to explain that variation if you're a dynamist, even if you have something that looks like a not bad explanation, you're already, it seems like, weakening your objection a bit, because you're already suggesting that lots of people are misreporting the way things seem to them, right? Because, I mean, unless the experiments are like wildly terrible, it does at least seem that the dynamist is going to have to say, look, insofar as we find variation in what people say about this, and I, as a dynamist, think everyone is experiencing time as passing, then what I have to say is a whole bunch of people are reporting that it doesn't seem that way. But now it seems like, at least on the face of it, that puts pressure on their claim that people are having very obvious experiences, that it's easy to report, and that there really shouldn't be any dispute about the fact that people are having those experiences, because you've conceded something. You've conceded that it's the kind of experience which a whole lot of people can report as being some other kind of experience. And that's already going to weaken any move you want to make from the purported fact that people have those experiences to the fact that our world isn't a block. Because, you know, if you were to say something, if you're a dynamist and you were to say something like, well, look, 30% of the people are wrong about their own experiences already. I mean, even if it's only 30%, already I'm going to say as a block universe theorist, well, dude, I'm really sketchy about how good people are at this thing. I don't want to, I now no longer find it very persuasive to suggest that our world can't be a block, because it's very obvious that everyone has these experiences, right?
Yeah, good. And in any case, if they want to say that the experimental results are wrong, well, then we might want some account for why we should think that's the case, or maybe they could give some or conduct some better or more robust experiments that show otherwise. At present, like, this is what we have, and this is the data we have to go on, and it seems to indicate that there's not the sort of more or less universal agreement of this dynamical temporal phenomenology and so on. So, yeah. If they want to say otherwise, then the onus is a bit on them.
Right. Yeah. So one other way you could think of this is as a kind of burden shifting enterprise. So I guess my claim is not that we have a complete experimental picture of how things seem to people or what they report. And my claim is not that there's no way that, for instance, dynamists could explain variation in what people say. Rather, the claim is a slightly weaker one, which is that, look, you dynamists kind of came out of the gate full-throatedly saying, look, here's the way the world seems to people, and you block universe theorists, you can't accommodate this. And what I take myself to be trying to do is say, look, slow down. It's not at all obvious that it does seem this way to people. There's kind of a huge variation in what we find. And of course, that leaves open that there is a story for dynamists to tell about why there's apparent variation. But at this stage, I take it that has significantly dented that kind of objection, which is not to say there's no potential response by the dynamists, or that they couldn't do future experimental work which shows why there's variation or shows why those experiments in some ways went wrong, but it just changes the dialectic as things stand, as I take it.
Right. Good. Okay. So I did want to move on. One of the, I mentioned Mark Balaguer's book previously, and one of the things that he discusses in some of the early chapters, I think mostly in chapter 2 and 3, concerns how whether the dispute is substantive. And as I mentioned earlier, it seems like we could at least speak in a substantive way where there's a real dispute here. But people who have listened or watched that interview with him may see that, well, I wasn't so convinced. I mean, I'm more worried about it than he was. So let me put that. Let me sort of try to briefly explain why I take that concern seriously. So when we say things like, for example, only what's present really exists, or there's no change in what exists impliciter, or there is a genuine change in what is present, and so on, I worry that the existential language here, like there is or what is and so on, is either temporally indexed, right? It's indexed to a time at which it's being uttered or considered, or it's not temporally indexed. And the worry might go that, well, if it's temporally indexed, then the sort of presentist slogans are correct, but sort of in a trivial way. It's like saying, well, what exists now exists now. Okay, sure. But that's not saying much of substance. And if it isn't temporally indexed, then maybe the eternalist slogans are correct, right? Because, I mean, if it exists at some time, then it's true, right? That it exists. I don't know. And I'm not sure that there's a way to frame at least a lot of the claims here in a way that's not just under one interpretation of the existential claim or another. I don't know if that's the cleanest way to say it, but anyway, what do you see with the worry that I'm getting at here and where I'm coming from?
Yeah, so there is that that whole kind of dispute in the literature about how to unpack, in this case, what presentism and eternalism are in such a way that they are genuinely distinct views. And I think the way you explain the worry there is right, because obviously it's true that what exists now, as it were. And everyone wants to allow that dinosaurs did exist. So there is this issue about, well, is there really a dispute here? So I, like Mark, do take the dispute to be substantive, although I don't know what I'm not sure what to say to somebody who is like, look, who basically says the thing that you said, right? So it seems to me that the only thing I can say is really to restate something which you're going to worry about anyway, which is to say, look, when I talk about what exists, I just mean everything. I don't mean, I'm not intending to restrict the domain in any way. So I'm not intending to restrict it to what exists now or what exists yesterday. Right? I'm just asking what exists, a simpliciter, as you put it, but what exists ... And then the only way I can understand that dispute is where the presentist says, well, everything that exists is all the stuff that exists now. If I make a complete inventory of all of reality, dinosaurs are just not on that list. Whereas the eternalist says, if I make a complete inventory of all of reality, dinosaurs are on that list. And as we were discussing earlier, when we were kind of imagining whole world in loaves, the eternalist is the view that like there's the whole loaf, and the presentist is the view that there's a single slice of the loaf. And at least imagistically, we can imagine those two possibilities. Now, it's true that once we get into trying to sort of represent that in some kind of formal language, we've got these issues about like what to do with tense and tenselessness. So I guess my own view is like, look, let's let somebody in the logic part of the world worry about exactly how to partition those two things. It does seem on the face of it as though we can make sense of that dispute. I can go into a second year metaphysics lecture and have enough of a conversation with people that they think they can understand that there is this distinction. That still leaves open that like maybe we're all wrong, maybe there really is only one view here, but at least it seems like conceptually we can distinguish these two things, because the eternalist really says that there are flesh and blood dinosaurs. They exist in exactly the same way that, like, I'm in Sydney right now, Singapore exists. There's a spatio-temporal relation that it bears to me here. It's as real as I am. There's stuff happening there. It seems like the eternalist thinks, well, there's a spatio-temporal relation between me and some dinosaurs, and they are perfectly, flesh and blood chaps. And the presentist thinks, no, there's a really substantive difference between my relation with Singapore and my relation with the dinosaurs. Namely, look, there's a spatial relation that connects me to Singapore. Singapore is a real place where there's like stuff happening. Dinosaurs, on the other hand, there is no spatio-temporal relation that connects me to any dinosaurs. They simply don't exist. So it's not that I don't take seriously that worry. Like it's not that I don't feel any force. It's not that if someone says to me, I don't understand how this dispute is real, I think to myself, wow, what is wrong with you? I can get myself into that mindset. I don't know what the right thing to say is other than to just say the exact same thing again, which is super unhelpful. I think actually doesn't help the person. I feel like that's not super helpful though.
No, that's fair. I mean, because one, like with the loaf analogy I gave earlier, you might be able to think of what about that I'm now suspicious, given what I've said now, which is that when we say that like all of the sort of slices of the loaf exist, and versus on the block theory, analogously speaking, and only one slice at a time exists on a say a presentist theory or that sort of dynamical theory. Well, it's true that at that time only that slice exists, but at other times the other slice exists, and I'm not sure that we can think of it's sort of appropriate to think of it in that way. I did want to mention a couple of years ago I talked with Tim Maudlin, and he does a lot of philosophy of physics stuff, and I think he was sort of confused about the dispute in a sort of similar way. Like he wants to say, look, is Aristotle real? It's like, well, you're not going to say he's fake, right? In a sense, he's real. He doesn't exist today, right? But that's not to say he's not real. So I guess he had this view of when we're quantifying over things, like we're talking about what exists, right? We're not just concerned with what exists now, because there were things that existed before and don't exist at this time. But to me, that just sounds like he's understanding the existence claim or the domain in a way where it's quantifying not over just the things that exist right now, but things that exist at all the times that have been or will be. And when Balaguer says things like, no, well, all that exists are the things that exist right now. If there's other things that exist, like where are they? Like that seems to me to be some sort of implicit commitment to understanding the domain or the existence as quantifying over, well, what presently exists. And I don't know. It's possible that I'm missing something, but it just seems to me like that's not a really substantive dispute. They're just quantifying or indexing the existential claims to different things. I don't know. And I do worry that, yeah, it does seem like we can have this discourse and a lot of people will grant that, or at least seem to think that there's a substantive dispute here. And I take that as evidence against my concern. But at the same time, I think that might be explained in part by, well, these sort of traditions that people have taken on of ways of speaking and thinking. And there's these different formalisms and slogans that may not actually be getting at something substantive. But anyway, I don't want to harp on that too much, but maybe you see the worry that I have here. And as we go forward, I'll try to ignore it. But
yeah. No. And I mean, you are certainly not alone in that worry, right? So there are a number of people who have tried to articulate, I have not tried to, that sounds like they didn't do it, a bunch of people who have had that worry. And there is currently a sort of, there's a back and forth in the literature about this. So it's not like the fact that you have this worry is evidence that you are like deeply confused because like no one else has ever thought this. There's a bunch of people who think, that the two views are equivalent, or sometimes it's put as, presentism is either, trivially false or the equivalent of eternalism. And so, I think that's I don't think that's an illegitimate thing to worry about. I just don't know what I can say to bring you over to the side of the people who think that it's like a substantive thing. I think, and I can certainly see why you might think that, right? That it is non-substantive. So the only thing I can say is when you would describe, so you were, in the case of the loaf, you were saying, I introduced this by saying like the eternalists think there's a whole loaf and the presentists think there's just this one slice. And then you said, but look, notice that the presentist is going to say, at this time there's just this one slice, and at this other time there's just this one slice, and at this other time there's just this one slice. But of course, everyone's going to agree that at that time there's just that one slice. And once you say that for all the slices, it just looks like you've got loaf back, right? And I suppose maybe the thing to press on there is something like, look, presentism better not be the claim that like, as of this particular slice of bread, only this slice exists. Because we can all agree that sort of index to that slice, there's that slice, which is, I take it, is precisely your kind of worry, right? That at each slice there's just that slice. Rather, it has to be something like, you have to find a way, and this is, of course, where the difficulty lies, in saying something more expansive. It has to be not just that at this slice, there's just this slice that is now. It has to be, at this slice, there just are no other slices anywhere. And of course, that just brings us back to this talk about what exists simpliciter and whether we can make good sense of that notion, whether we really can distinguish these two views by doing that.
Right. Yeah. The presentist, for example, could say something like, no, it's not just that only the slice exists, but they can say something stronger, like, and it's only this slice exists in a non-perspectival or not essentially temporally indexed way or something like that. And that could be explored. And I worry that either they're going to say something obviously false, or it's going to be something that would suffer from the same worry. But that's my suspicion, but that could be explored. Or I'm not sure I would really understand what's being said there. But again, that could be some limitation of mine. But yeah, I mean, I guess as we proceed, I'll try to ignore these concerns, although they might inevitably come up. They definitely kept coming up in my discussion with Mark, but it is what it is. Yeah, so maybe at this point we could focus in on some of the arguments in favor of dynamical views that you consider, starting with perhaps the most important one, the kind of experiential argument. Basically, the argument goes something like this: look, we have these perceptual experiences that are sort of like this sort of is of time robustly passing. And the best explanation for those sorts of experiences, well, that time robustly passes. Yeah, so maybe you could explain this argument for the dynamical views a bit more, and then some of your concerns for that argument.
Yeah, so that argument, I guess it's a way of trying to shoehorn a whole bunch of things that dynamists have thought. So it's all shoehorned into a particular argument that goes via explanation. There are other ways you might want to spell out the same sort of sentiments. I guess the underlying sentiment is something like the world seems to us a certain way. And in this case, it seems as though time, as you put it, robustly passes. And the reason I put the robustly in there is just because I take it that there's some trivial sense in which everyone agrees, including, block theorists, that it seems to us as though time passes. So we started this interview about 10 a.m. I was like frantically running back from the dog park. I was like, oh my God, we have 7 minutes to get in the door. It's now, by my time, like 11:09. It's very clear that, in a pretty straightforward sense, time has passed. So there is temporal duration between the time that we started and now. And I am now having different experiences than I was having then. And what's more, I have memories of what happened earlier in this exchange. So I take it that in that sense of time passing, namely that there is a kind of temporal dimension and there are durations between, temporal durations between events, that seems to be completely unproblematic for the block theorists, because after all, they think that there really is a block of events and events really are separated by temporal distances, or at least spatiotemporal distances. And of course, they're going to allow that, there's a version of me, if you will, at 10 o'clock or at 5 to 10 being saying to the dogs, hurry up and eat your breakfast, we've got to get upstairs. And now there's the current version of me saying this stuff. So when dynamists talk about, they're having this experience of temporal passage, and that experience being one that is, at least suggests that our world isn't a block universe. It has to be more than just that we have that experience. It has to be something more. And the more is what I call robust passage. And roughly speaking, it's the idea that this moment seems especially real to me compared to all the other moments. And what's more, that it really seems to me as though there are certain events that are lying in my future and which are kind of coming ever closer. So I have a 2:00 meeting today. So there's this sense that time is passing and that 2:00 meeting is becoming ever closer to me. At some point it will become present and I'll be in that meeting doing whatever 2:00 meetings involve. And then eventually it will, recede into the past and get further and further away. And the thought is that there is that real sense that we have that time passes, in that sense that there's a real fact of the matter about which moments really are present, namely the ones that we're in right now. And that future things really feel like they're coming towards us, especially when they're bad things. But they feel like they become present and then they feel like they move into the past. So that's the purported experience of time passing that kind of dynamists point to. And that's the thing I'm calling robust passage. And then, of course, if people really do have those experiences, then that does present a prima facie problem for the block theorist, because the block theorist says that there's nothing in our world like that. They say that there is no moment that really is the present moment. All of them are exactly the same with respect to presentness. And there is no sense in which anything's moving towards you and then receding, right? Nothing is moving at all in the block, temporally speaking. Everything is just located at the time it's located. So if dynamists are right and things really do seem that way, then that's not to say that the block automatically that the block universe view is mistaken, but it does present a challenge, right? And the challenge would be to explain how it is that people are having all these experiences of the world being other than the way the world is. And that's not an insurmountable problem, because of course we do sometimes have experiences of the world being a way that it isn't. Our experiences are not always completely veridical, but it would present a kind of challenge. And so one way of framing what that challenge consists in is in terms of this kind of explanatory argument that I put in the mouth of the dynamist, which is basically to say, look, this first premise is just to assert the claim that things really do seem that way. Then there's a claim that, look, the best explanation for that, maybe it's the only explanation, but it's at least the best one, is that the world really is that way. So we have a reason to think that the world is that way. There's other ways you could frame that argument. You could frame it as a kind of setting up a challenge to the block theorist, as sort of giving you some evidence that our world is not a block universe way. But that's the way I sort of try and shoehorn those very general concerns that the dynamist has. And so then, a substantial amount of the book is kind of devoted to trying to respond to that argument. And I think that's partly because that's probably the most common sort of argument that comes out of dynamism. I consider a bunch of other ways you might try to appeal to our experiences of the world in a temporal way to get the conclusion that we should be dynamists. But I think this is the one that you most often find in the literature. It's the one that's most often explored, and so it's the one I spend most time on. And in this particular case, what I mostly wanted to do is to undermine that very first premise. In fact, my view is that they are probably both false. But in this book, I'm most interested in defending a sort of view according to which the world just doesn't seem that way. And so there really is no explanatory burden to be had on behalf of the block theorist.
Good. So, yeah, I think it's, a lot of people might find that odd. It's like, well, of course it seems to us like there's a sort of dynamic passage. What sort of concerns do you raise against that's where the content actually is, that we have a content of that sort?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of places that comes from. So partly I try and use some empirical work to sort of undermine this claim that people really do have these experiential seemings. It would be nice to do some more work on that. It would be nice to have better access to the way things really do seem to people. There's, of course, a real difficulty here, which is that, like, you can't plug directly into people's heads. So, like, in an ideal world, you would find a way to somehow, like, suck out people's experiences and look at them. But obviously, like, we can't do that. Maybe at some point, I mean, it's not even clear if you had access to, like, brain scans and things that you would be able to figure out exactly what people were experiencing. So the best you can do is find ways of asking people about their experiences. And obviously this has significant limitations, because you're asking people to report sort of how things seem to them, and people could be mistaken in various kinds of ways. And that is something that I talk about a bit in the book. And in fact, one of the things that I suggest is that when people are reporting that it seems to them that way, they are in fact kind of making misreports. So I take that possibility very seriously. But part of the project of the book is to suggest that, look, when we look at the kind of empirical evidence about what people do say about their own experiences, we don't find that very significant majorities of people are very strongly reporting that they do have those kind of experiences. And that at least begins to undermine the claim that that is really how things seem to people, because you might expect that in general, people would be not bad at reporting how things seem. I mean, of course, there are some difficulties here, right? But insofar as people had a really clear, powerful, overwhelming seeming as of things being a certain way, you might expect to find that they're all kind of largely reporting that. So part of the project of undermining that first claim about seemings is an appeal to a kind of fairly large set of kind of experimental data in this regard about what people say about their own experiences. And then I guess the other thing I'm doing, and this bit isn't so much targeted at, well, so I guess there's two other things I'm trying to do in this part of the book that's dealing with these claims about the way things seem to people. So some of it is taking up and trying to, in some ways, argue against a particular way that block theorists have sometimes responded. So when you look at that argument, you notice, like, well, it's a very simple argument. It only has these kind of two premises and a conclusion. So if you're a block theorist, there's only two possible ways of responding. You can either reject the claim that things really do seem that way, or you can allow that they do seem that way, but try and explain them seeming that way, consistent with our world being a block. And a lot of block theorists traditionally have gone that second route. So they've said, yeah, look, it does seem to us as though time really does robustly pass, and here's my explanation of how it could be that creatures like us who have evolved in this block have come to have those experiences. That's a really interesting research agenda. which I definitely think is kind of worth pursuing. But I wanted in this book to say some things about why I worry about that agenda. And in particular, I guess I have a broad sort of worry, which is that that agenda is really positing that we're all kind of subject to this almost universal, all-powerful illusion as of time passing. Because if you concede that things are the way the dynamist says, then that's to concede that all of us all the time are experiencing time as really robustly passing in this sense, right? It's not your standard illusion in any way. So we've all presumably experienced various kinds of perceptual or other illusions. We've seen sticks as being bent in water when in fact they're straight. We've maybe some people, we've had local hallucination of various things. We've all experienced kind of the standard psychology perceptual illusions of like seeing two lines as being one longer than the other when in fact they're the same length. Like there's a lot of these perceptual illusions because like psychologists have a lot of fun messing around with our perceptual systems to try and get us to see things in ways that they aren't, right? So there's lots of color illusions. And this is really cool. This is really interesting empirical work, which tells us a lot about the way our kind of perceptual systems work, right? It sort of tells us how data is processed, because what it tells you is things about how things go awry when you do certain sorts of things with stimuli in the world, like in the case of the Muller-Lyer illusion, when you put arrows at the end of lines. But what's interesting about all those illusions is like they're very local and they're very temporary, right? So we don't have a kind of universal overwhelming illusion as of lines being the not the length that they are. Likewise, for all of these sorts of things, you are subject to them under very particular conditions, and often they're conditions that you require a psychologist to come and find. So it's when the environment is a very particular way, something happens with your perceptual system or with the cognitive processing or whatever, which kind of generates this illusion. And we've then got various kind of explanations for why that is, that appeals to like what those features of the environment were and why it is that the perceptual system generated this kind of illusory output on the basis of that. And it's fascinating on a case-by-case basis what those explanations are. But usually they're going to appeal to the fact that the perceptual system evolved in a certain sort of way to be generally delivering pretty reliable perceptual outputs in the sense of experiences, and that within the kind of constraints of processing and inputs and so forth, there are just some ways that the environment can present which gives you the wrong output, but which is generally speaking not a problem for the environment, for the creature in its environment. That is a very different picture than the picture that we would be giving if we thought that all of us were all the time having this illusion of passage. That whatever, maybe we can make sense of that, but it just strikes me as being a radically different kind of explanatory project. It's just not a project where we have this local illusion produced by having perceptual systems that are generally pretty good, right? I mean, and they generally speaking have to be pretty good because like if you're an evolved creature and your perceptual system is just terrible, like someone's going to eat you or you're going to fall in a ravine or you're going to be like super hungry, like perceptual systems have to be good enough for you to get food and not be eaten and not fall into holes and so forth. So we're positing here a perceptual system that nevertheless is constantly subject to this illusion. And so I think that places significant difficulties in explaining that using any of the normal sorts of resources we have for explaining illusions. That doesn't yet show that it's not possible, but I worry about how that would go. So that's a sort of general form of worry I have about that explanatory project on behalf of other block theorists. And then I guess the other bit of this that I'm interested in is just and here I want to say that there's already been a lot of work in this area, but on the face of it, you might think that, look, the dynamist has a really nice explanation of why it seems to us that time passes, if it does in fact seem that way, and if time does in fact pass, right? So your initial thought is something like, look, obviously the dynamist has a great explanation here because in general, if you have experiences as of pink elephants, and there really are pink elephants. Like, there's a really easy story to tell here about how it is that you have those experiences, namely that you're just having a veridical experience of the pink elephants that there are. Like, of course there's a story, like a psychological and neuroscientific story that still needs to be spelled out about like how it is we see pink elephants. But like at some level, like it's a really simple story. You see them because they're there, right? So part of the book is interested also in pursuing the fact that it's not so obvious, even if there were robust passage, how anybody would be in a position to kind of be having experiences of it. So that's, I guess, the other way I want to put pressure on the dynamist. So they've got this claim as part of this argument that like positing robust passage is a great explanation for having experiences, that there is robust passage. Now, I don't think that there are such experiences, but if there were, I'm having trouble seeing how we would, in fact, have those experiences. And that's largely because it seems like the mere fact that a particular set of events really is present doesn't seem like the kind of thing you can perceptually detect. The mere fact that only these things around here exist, and for instance, Aristotle doesn't seem to be something that I can perceptually detect, right? So even if I were in a presentist world and it's just you and me and Aristotle no longer exists, it's not really clear why things would seem any different to me, given that I'm just experiencing things as they are at this time, than if I were in a block world where I would also be just experiencing things as they are at this time. It's not as if I'm ever in a position to be experiencing directly like past things. Like I can't be exchanging words with Aristotle and saying something like, oh, wow, he seems like a really pale imitation of himself. So the book does want to put some pressure on the idea that the presence of robust passage would be a good explanation of it seeming as though time passes. It's not clear to me that it would, because it seems to me that the right thing to say is that things would seem the same whether time passes or not. And if that's true, then it's not really clear why the presence of passage would be any kind of explanation for things seeming that way. So that's the broad landscape of that section. Is one of it is kind of about friendly fire, which is actually like friendly fire towards a particular block universe strategy to responding to this argument. And the other is non-friendly fire. It's fire towards the dynamist, trying to put pressure on the idea that the presence of robust passage is any kind of explanation for it seeming to us as though time passes.
Good. Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. And one thing I did want to touch on, one of the arguments you consider against the dynamical argument there is that, well, there's reason to think that it's not even possible to have those contents. And so it's just not possible that we have the sort of experience as of time passing in that way, or as time being dynamic in that way. I mean, I guess I could introduce that more, but like, could you talk a little bit more about this? You have this, you invoke intentionalism there, and discuss that a little bit. And if it's just not possible, then time is dynamic in that way, then there's just not any possible contents of our experiences or beliefs of that sort. Do you want to introduce that a little bit more, and then I'll have a follow-up on that.
Yeah, so this is supposed to be a problem for, this is a friendly fire problem. So that's not so much the problem that if there really is passage, we couldn't experience it, although I do have a view that that's true too. This is meant to be a problem for my fellow block theorist who thinks that we have experiences of time passing, but there really isn't any time passing to experience, right? So this is meant to be a problem for the thought that we're all subject to this kind of illusory experience. So I earlier said that one reason to be skeptical of that is it just seems like it's an odd illusion because it can't be explained in the normal sorts of ways. So that's one kind of argument. And then you've articulated another one that I try to offer, which is basically the thought that in order to have illusions as of the world being a certain sort of way, you have to have mental states that represent the world being that way. So, when you look at a stick in the water and you see it as bent, what you're doing is having a mental state that represents the stick as bent. However, exactly, whether it's a kind of imagistic state or it's a kind of propositional state. So there has to be a way of having a mental state with that kind of content. And so there's various ways this argument might go. So some block theorists actually think that not only is there no robust passage in our world, but robust passage is kind of completely incoherent. Like there's no world like that. So if there's no world like that, then there's a kind of argument against there being mental states with that content. So a lot of people think that not what determines their content, but like what captures their content is some function to a set of possible worlds, right? So that's kind of the content of a mental state. But if there is no robust passage, and necessarily so, then there's no set of worlds where time really passes. So there's one way of putting that is that there's no way to have that mental state because there's no content to have. Maybe without getting into the horrible nitty-gritty of sort of the argument there, maybe one way of putting it is that if you think that temporal passage is kind of completely incoherent, like there's no way a world could be in which there's passage, it's at least not unnatural to think, well, then obviously you couldn't have experiences like that. So by analogy, like think about a square circle, right? So that's an impossible thing. There are no square circles and there simply couldn't be. And what's more, if you said to me, oh man, like I was walking into work and I had this illusory experience of a square circle, I'd be like, wait, what? Like, what the heck is that, man? Like, there's no coherent way things could be, which is the square circle way. So you couldn't have that mental state. I mean, there's various other mental states in the vicinity you could have. You could have a false belief that you're having an experience, which is an illusion of a square circle. You could have an illusion of something being circular when in fact it's square. Like there's a range of candidates here, but what you're definitely not having, it seems, is an illusion of a square circle because there's just no mental state that can represent that. So that's meant to be one argument here, which is, look, if you're the kind of block theorist who thinks that temporal passage just makes no sense, then you really shouldn't be what I call an illusionist. You shouldn't think that we are kind of having illusions of passage. Albeit that there isn't any, because it's really hard to make sense of what that would even be. That's basically like saying we're kind of having illusions of square circles. Now, of course, there are block theorists who think that there isn't any passage around here in our world, but there could be. So there are possible worlds where there is passage. It's not an incoherent thing. It's just that it isn't actual. Then things become much more complicated in trying to argue against that view. Roughly speaking, So I do have arguments, but the very rough idea is something like, look, what is it to have a mental state that represents something? So like, what is it to have a mental state that represents, like a pink lion? So I'm assuming there aren't any actual pink lions in our world. But it's relative. I mean, there could be. It seems like lions could come in pink. Let's grant that at any rate. Maybe you have some evolutionary story under which you think they wouldn't be lions, but it seems like they could be, and it seems like certainly people can imagine pink lions, right? Even though there aren't any. How are they doing that? Like there's a kind of puzzle here, right? You can even imagine somebody having a kind of imagistic mental representation of a pink lion, which is very much like a kind of perceptual state, except that there's no pink lion in front of them. How do they do that? Well, one plausible story might be, well, look, they do have representations of lions that they can token in their mind. Like they can bring to the fore in their mind a kind of representation of a lion because either they've seen lions in the wild or they've seen pictures of them or they've probably seen a David Attenborough documentary that has lions, right? So they can definitely represent lions. They've seen a lot of pink things. So like there's pink all over the place. People can definitely represent pinkness. So it's actually pretty straightforward to generate in yourself a representation of a pink lion because it's really just a matter of kind of meshing together two representations you already have, a lion and pinkness, and just creating in your mind's eye a kind of pink lion. Okay, easy. This is pretty much how you might think we come to represent things that don't actually exist. We kind of take bits of representations, we take representations of things that do exist that we have because they exist, and then we kind of smooch them together, to use a super technical term there. Let's suppose that that's how let's suppose that's roughly the right kind of account of how we end up having these kind of mental contents. Then suppose you think that there isn't any robust passage in our world, but that somehow we are having representations of it because we're having these experiences. Then it seems like to make sense of that, you have to be committed to the idea that there are all of these representations we have, and some way of combining them in the same way that we can combine a representation of a lion and pinkness to get a pink lion somehow generates this experience of robust passage. And I guess part of the point of the book is to suggest, look, I don't really, like, the burden is on you here, my friend, is I guess what I want to say here, but I'm having a hard time figuring out how that happens. So, like, for a range of representations of non-actual things, I see how they really are combinations of actual things, right? So pink lions, flying cows, spotted labradoodles. No, there are spotted labradoodles, but, for lots of those things, that's how that works. It's very hard to see, at least for me, how this kind of, how robust passage is just sort of a combination of actual stuff. Given that it's meant to be, it's this metaphysically heavyweight thing in which there really is something special about the present, which singles it out from all the other moments. There really is a fact about pastness and futurity. There really is a fact about things moving around. So what I want to say to my block theorist, interlocutor is, well, tell me a story about how I come to represent temporal passage, given that you and I agree there isn't any, as a function of kind of recombining just bog standard representations that we have, right? So I have representations of dogs and pillows and trees, and I have representations of durations. Like I can represent that there's 5 minutes between these two events. And I have lots of kinds of representations. Tell me how it is my brain comes to kind of jigger those around in such a way that it comes up with this illusion, which then I'm always subject to. And I guess the argument of the book is that I don't see how to do that. Now, of course, that's like, I'm not the last word on this. Maybe someone has something better to say, but it's meant to be a kind of burden shifting thing, which is like, if you think that that's the right story to tell, like, tell me how that happens. And that's supposed to be a reason to be skeptical already of the idea that we really are subject to this illusion. If you are a block theorist, right? If you're a block theorist, I think that you should think, wait, we live in a block. Why on earth would we be subject to this illusion of living in a dynamical world? So that this is not quite the same way of framing that objection, but I do think it's a good way of putting it, which is, look, we live in a block world. We're these evolved organisms which have to ambulate around in this block world. Why would we at all times be subject to an illusion as of being in some metaphysically very different world? It's very hard to see why. It's hard to see how we could be, but it's also hard to see why we would be. It's easy to see for some illusions why your perceptual system might generate them, and it's easy to see for some illusions how creatures could come to be subject to that kind of illusion, given the kinds of creatures they are. So, like, maybe we're subject to an illusion of free will. That is definitely not my view, but you can see how you could pursue that agenda, right? You can see how you could tell some story about how evolved creatures have to have this sense of being, free in some sense, or like evolved social creatures. It's wild, I think, to think that perfectly ordinary evolved creatures somehow misrepresent the deep metaphysics of their world. Like, why would that be? So that's sort of the thing that I'm trying to push on here.
Yeah, really good. A couple things I want to touch on there. One, well, what if someone tried to say something like, well, okay, but we already have sort of experiences of things going in and out of existence in some sense, right? That I exist now, but didn't exist some time ago, or whatever. Things are changing in some sense. And well, what if we just say that we can talk about the present moment, and maybe we can say that in some way applies to the present as well? What is present now, and it's going to go out of existence, and a new present. I don't know. Maybe there's some sense in which we can combine those thoughts or concepts in that way, in a way that would explain why we have content of this dynamical content, even though all those things I mentioned are maybe compatible with a block view, arguably. Maybe something like that. I don't know. Maybe that's not satisfactory, but what do you think?
Yeah, so I sort of consider something a bit like this. So I think you're on to the right sort. I think this is the place the dynamists probably should go, right? Which is, you're right that we have ordinary experiences of change. We have ordinary experiences of different things being the case at different times. We do have experiences of things going into and out of existence in some sense, like not necessarily the sense that the block theorist thinks they go into existence, but yeah, so obviously there is stuff here with us now that was not here with us earlier, and vice versa. So the question is, is that enough to, is there a way of recombining that to get genuine dynamism? So I think that is an interesting project to try and pursue, to try and see if you can do that. I guess I'm skeptical just in the sense that it seems like maybe you need more than that to get genuine dynamism. So certainly the stuff that the veridical kinds of experiences you have in a block, which is experiences of things changing in the sense that they're different at different times, and of experiencing different things being present at different times, and of there being things now that didn't exist were located at earlier times. We have all of those resources. The question is there a way to genuinely recombine those kind of perspectival experiences? Because they really are, what's characteristic of those is that things are present to you at different times because, of course, you're located at different times. So there's a kind of experience of a kind of perspectival presentness. There's experience of kind of, in some sense, what you think of perspectival change, in that at different times, like different stuff is there, and that's what constitutes change. Can a recombination of kind of perspectival change, perspectival presentness, can that be combined to generate an experience or a content of robust passage? I'm skeptical that it can, but I think you're right to push that maybe that's an avenue to pursue. And I guess my skepticism is just that how could recombining perspectival presentness and perspectival change, how could they deliver genuine robust passage, which is precisely meant to be not those things, right? It's supposed to be entirely distinct from those things because, of course, it's the fact that you have the kind of non-perspectival absolute experiences of passage, which are meant to motivate the thought that our world isn't a block universe. So it had better be something well and truly over and above any of those perspectival things, because if that's all we were experiencing, then that would just be to have veridical experiences of the block, which is, of course, what I think we are having. But yeah, so I'm skeptical, but I grant that that's a potential avenue that the dynamists could try to pursue there.
Right, good. And I did want to ask, because one of the things that Balaguer defends in his book is the thesis that, well, actually, he doesn't necessarily argue for presentism in that book. He's mostly defending it against objections, but he thinks that whether it's true is a contingent matter, right? There's no sort of, he doesn't think there's any sort of incoherence or a metaphysical absurdity in it being true or it being false. So there's some possible worlds that are presentist worlds, some possible worlds that are eternalist worlds, and maybe there's different structures and different things you can say about the dynamical aspects of time. Do you share that view, or do you think that no, the block universe is true, and you couldn't have had a sort of presentist or dynamical aspect of time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not. I think it might depend what time of day you ask me. So, look, on the one hand, so the reason I'm drawn to accept the sort of view that Mark does, that these things are contingent, is that obviously I do, I get up to teach a metaphysics class, and I find myself able to articulate what presentism involves, right? I explain it, I draw pictures on the board. I don't feel like I'm saying empty, meaningless things in the way that I would be if I was saying to them, like, imagine that this square is circular, right? I would imagine that the students would just be like, what the dickens, lady? So that seems to be some evidence that it's a coherent view, and I think coherence is sort of the gold standard of whether something is genuinely possible or not. So that leads me to the kind of the Balaguer view that these are contingent matters, and so that would lead me to think, yeah, there are possible presentist worlds, they're just not actual. On the other hand, I do, there is also some. I do feel the kind of McTaggart worry about these things, which is that when you start to when you're trying to explain presentism or indeed any dynamical view to students, invariably I appeal to the kind of heuristic in where I pull us all out of space-time and I imagine us looking down on the world from not within, from outside of it. And I imagine that there's this like one three-dimensional slice of space-time which is changing. And I say, look, that's presentism right there, right? Look down on it, you see that there's only ever this one three-dimensional slice, and it's changing as time passes. And compare that to, a picture in which there's a block that grows or or just a static block. And then it's because I'm heavily drawn to explaining in that way that I then think, but wait, of course, that only makes sense if you have this kind of hypertemporal perspective that you can, in fact, inhabit, right? And I think in a way that's to push on exactly what worried McTaggart about the fact that every time is going to be both past, present and future. It's not exactly the same worry, but I think it's a kind of worry in the same vicinity, which is that the only real way of making sense of how it can be that there's kind of dynamism in the world is by thinking that there's some other temporal matrix along which we can talk about the world growing or changing or being different at different times. And I am somewhat drawn to the thought that we can only do this with some kind of hypertemporal metric, because I find it so hard to explain those views without actually taking on that perspective. But of course, if that's true, then it seems like we run the risk of having kind of infinite regress of these higher temporal dimensions. And that leads me to worry that maybe the views are in there, just straight first order view, are in fact incoherent because they are, in a sense, only sensible when you measure them against some other temporal dimension, which typically dynamists don't want to do. So that's all a long-winded way of saying that sometimes I think that temporal passage is at base incoherent, because to talk of the whole world changing only makes sense if there's something with respect to with respect to which it is changing, namely a hypertemporal dimension. And sometimes I think, no, obviously there could be presentist worlds, there could be growing block worlds. The fact that I can make sense of what those would be is good reason to think that we should be contingentists. So because I can kind of go either way on this, in the book I try and sort of formulate arguments both conditional on you being a kind of contingentist about this and conditional on you thinking that, for instance, temporal passage just makes no sense and there isn't a way that a world could be. So for better or worse, those kinds of arguments are both present in the book. And that is because, partly because it has more dialectical force, because some block theorists do think passage is impossible and some think it's possible, but also because I am kind of deeply undecided about this issue.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And there's a lot that could be explored there for sure. I remember, I think it was in Michael Lockwood's book called The Labyrinth of Time. I remember reading about some of the McTaggart worries, and there I think he argued that there is a sort of regress here, but it's actually just benign. It's just you get these entailment relations, but doesn't actually show anything's ungrounded or unexplained or something like that. And that seemed plausible to me at the time, but maybe there's still worries there or related worries that would, if successful, show that the dynamical views are not possible or are contradictory in some sense. But we don't need to resolve that now. Just as one more quick thing on the intentionalist-based argument, I wonder though, and you discussed there's some worries for intentionalism and maybe this hyper-intentionalist or other accounts of content here that they wouldn't get this argument off the ground. But even if we go with an intentionalist view, and if the dynamical views are impossible, then we just can't have contents of dynamism. Well, okay. Nevertheless, it seems in other cases there are things that are impossible that we can't, strictly speaking, have contents of. But it might seem to us that we do, and we can still make judgments based on those things. And so maybe what we want to take as data are at least those seemings that we have contents of that sort, and not necessarily that we do have contents of that sort. For example, it could seem to me that the mind is non-physical. Maybe that's impossible. Or it can seem to me that, I don't know, the Goldbach conjecture is false. I don't know how that would seem to me that way, but I don't know. And if it turns out that the content of the belief that the Goldbach conjecture is false, or the content of the belief that the mind is non-physical is empty, or just points at the empty set of worlds or something like that, well, okay, but there's still this sort of seeming to me that it is contentful, and that's the case. So I don't know. Maybe that. Do you see what I'm getting at there? Then there still feels like there's something to be explained, even if it's empty in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't disagree with that. So I do try and say a little bit about this. So I think you're right that it would be premature to just say something like, "Well, there's no content like that, so we're all done here," right? that seems like it. It just leaves a whole bunch of things puzzling, including the very thing that you were just saying, which is that, well, like, why? One way of thinking about it just seems to push the explanatory bump in the rug, because now we've got this further thing, which is like, wait, there's no content like that, but people think that there's a content like that. Like, what's going on there then, man, right? So I would hope that there is some story to be told about that exact thing, which is something like, if you have this intentionalist view and you think that there is no passage, then you don't think that anyone is ever having experiences as a robust passage, because that's just not a thing they can do. But yes, it could still be that people in some sense think that they are, or that they do something that looks like reporting that they are, or they say that they believe that they do, like all of these things, right? And we definitely want to have some account of what's going on there. And I think some of what I want to say in the book, which is meant to be sort of an explanation of why people at least seem to report, or why some people at least seem to report that time does pass for them, at least in the sense that they use language that suggests that. One thing I think we do want to do is take those kinds of explanations and maybe use them as explanations for why people are kind of having mistaken views about what sorts of experiences they are in fact having. And I guess the thing that's going to be, I mean, it's a complicated explanatory task here, because you've got some kind of experience that presumably does have you have an experience with some content, but it's not the content that you think that it does have. So then you've got, you both want to explain, like, what is the content of the experience, and then you want to explain what is going on, like, what is the content of the false beliefs or the false reports or whatever. So what's going on there? Because obviously the content can't be that you believe in some sense, some full-blooded sense, that it's an experience of passage if you can't even represent passage. So you need then some explanation of, like, what even is that thing? And then you also need an explanation of why you have that thing too, right? So if you started off with a bog standard, nice veridical experience of your block world, right, which is kind of what I want to say, there's still something puzzling here, which is, man, why are all these people so damn confused that they are now going around believing that they are having contents of robust passage when those contents are not even possible ones, right? That's a strikingly weird thing. I don't know exactly what the right explanation for that is, but I'm hoping that some of the explanations that I do offer by way of things that change what people report in terms of whether they experience passage or not will do double duty as explaining kind of what's going on with respect to those reportages or apparent beliefs or whatever. But I totally agree that that's where the action now lies, right? The explanatory burden cannot just be, oh, well, you can't have states like that, so I guess we can all go home and have scones and cream. That's definitely not where things lie.
Yeah, good. So I did want to jump to one of the other arguments in favor of the dynamical views that you consider. And one of those is just that, look, it seems that we have these tense attitudes, especially about things that we care about and our preferences. We really care about what's going to happen or what might happen in the future, in a way that we don't care as much, or in some cases even at all, about what happened in the past. That's sort of over and done with, and the stuff in the future, that's genuinely stuff that is different in an important way. And it seems like, or you might argue that the best explanation for this sort of asymmetry or this bias in our attitudes and preferences is, well, that there's just the dynamical features of time really are there. That's the way the world is. Anyway, I'm maybe not expressing all the details there, but I mean, how would you explain in a bit more detail maybe the inference here and what issues you take with it?
Yeah, so there's a kind of cluster of arguments here which all pick up on different aspects of kind of what you might think of very broadly as temporal attitudes. So you've articulated one there, which is that we have different preferences for where things are in time, past or future. So we have kind of past future asymmetric attitudes. So we tend to prefer that like bad stuff is in the past rather than being in the future, and that good stuff is in the future rather than the past. There's other sorts of temporal attitudes. So like we have this attitude of what Kristie Miller calls temporal relief, which is the thing that Pryor talks about as, when you're very relieved that the dental procedure is, quote, over and done with, right? So nobody is experiencing huge amounts of relief that their dental procedure is tomorrow, but we can all experience a lot of relief that it was yesterday. So this is another kind of temporally asymmetric attitude. And on the face of it, at least, it seems like that attitude seems pretty reasonable. At the very least, we certainly have it. People are definitely relieved that things are over and not when they're in the future. And we also know that people definitely have temporally asymmetric preferences because we've done a lot of empirical work at the Centre for Time, but also elsewhere, kind of probing those sorts of preferences. So one way you might try and leverage that in favour of arguing for dynamism is by saying something like, look, what grounds, I suppose there's two ways you could pursue this. You could think that this is a matter of explanation. So you could think that the only thing that could explain our having those kinds of attitudes in the ways that we do are that time really does pass. Or you could put that in terms of a sort of normative claim. So I think it's more often put as a normative claim. So the thinking there is something like, look, it's obviously rational or correct or fitting or something in that vicinity to be relieved that your dental procedure is over, and done with, given that it's yesterday. And it's obviously just not any of those things if it's tomorrow. So we just take a different normative view about that. And likewise, in the case of temporal preferences, some people, although this is much more controversial, some people are going to think, yeah, you should prefer that the dental procedure is yesterday rather than tomorrow. You should prefer that the birthday cake is tomorrow rather than yesterday. Now, that's more controversial, but in either case, you can see how an argument could go, which says something like, look, what grounds those things being like reasonable attitudes to have, like correct ones, fitting ones, in this temporally asymmetric way, is that there's really a distinction between past and future, right? It's not just a kind of perspectival matter. What makes temporal relief reasonable is that the thing, when it's past, really is over and done with. Like, it's past. It's not just like subjectively past. It's really like back there in the past. And the reason why you shouldn't be temporally relieved about it tomorrow is that it really is future. And what's more, it's going to become present. It's like it's heading for you, man, right? That's not good. And likewise for sort of grounding the rationality of those kind of temporal preferences. So the argument would be something like, look, those preferences are correct ones, or they're fitting, they're normatively right. The only thing that could explain them being temporal, being fitting on all those ways, is if there really is a distinction between past, present, and future, which is non-perspectival, and that's to think that our world would be dynamical. And so consequently, we should think our world is dynamical. Or I guess another way of putting it would be like the block universe view cannot accommodate it being reasonable to have those kind of attitudes, but they are reasonable. So all the worse for the block universe view. So yeah, the book wants to take up this claim that the only way those things could be reasonable is if our world is genuinely dynamical. So this is not a part of the book where I want to disagree that we have those attitudes. So in the previous part of the book, I want to suggest that we don't really have experiences as of time passing. But in this part of the book, I want to concede that people really do have those kinds of temporal preferences. People really do experience temporal relief. So I don't want to disagree with the stated phenomenon here. Instead, I want to try and undermine that second kind of premise, which is that the only way those things could be reasonable is if our world is dynamical. And I guess the broad structure of the argument there is something like, look, it really seems like our normative judgments about the reasonableness of those things are not in any way tracking dynamical features of our world. And so if you think that part of what motivates you to be sure that those things really are reasonable is by kind of consulting your judgments about them, by consulting, like, what would you say to the person who says, well, I'm so relieved about this surgery tomorrow? Or who says, oh, look, I really prefer my painful surgeries to be tomorrow rather than yesterday. I think for most people, what grounds them having a view about whether those things are reasonable is by kind of consulting their own and their friends' kind of normative judgments. So if you think your normative judgments are some kind of guide to whether those things are reasonable, then you should think that your normative judgments are tracking robust passage. If you think it's robust passage that is like making them reasonable. And I think that that's just obviously not true. And we can see that just by imagining cases where there's robust passage, but where the kind of facts about robust passage kind of come apart from where things lie perspectively for you. So in the book, I think I offer a bunch of kind of like little time travel cases and some other sorts of cases. But roughly speaking, all of those cases are kind of trying to pull apart two things. So one is, where is this event kind of in robust external time? So is it earlier or later than you in proper like dynamical time? And the other is like, where is it relative to you kind of perspectively? So is it kind of in your subjective past or your subjective future? So I give these cases and then I sort of ask the reader to consult their own intuitions. And I say, look, reader, surely you'll be like me and you will think that what matters here is not like where this thing is in dynamical time. You're going to think what matters for how much you care about it is where it is like subjectively relevant, related to you. And I haven't done any empirical work on this, but I would be very surprised if it were not like subjective location that matters to people. And if that's true, then it tends to undermine the idea that people's normative judgments are tracking like features of dynamical time, right? It strongly suggests they're tracking where things are in subjective time. But of course, the block universe theorist thinks that there's plenty of subjective time. They think that all of those things exist in the block time. They just don't think that there are these dynamical features. So if that's right, then the block theorist can give a perfectly good account of why those things might be perfectly reasonable in a block world, because after all, they're going to think that there are things that are subjectively earlier and things that are subjectively later than we were. And they can provide some grounds for differentially caring about those if they want to do that. So, of course, they may not want to. In the case of temporal preferences, they might think that we shouldn't care more about future pains than past pains. But at least on the face of it, they have all the resources to do that if they want to. And so I want to say that that argument doesn't go through, that even if those attitudes are all reasonable, the block theorists can accommodate their reasonability perfectly well.
Good. Yeah. I was thinking about this, and I want to see what you think about my thoughts here. First, yeah, I mean, it does seem like, of course, I tend to care more about things in the future, especially if they're in my future that I care about than in my past. But it's not, even on a block theory, I think there's plausible psychological and evolutionary explanations for why that would be the case. You know, it tends to be that what I do now can have a greater impact on things that are in the future. I tend to already know more about the past than about the future. And I don't know, it seems to me like there's plausible explanations for why I would have these asymmetric concerns without requiring that there's a fundamental dynamical aspect to time. And moreover, it seems to me that there can be cases that might even undermine or not require this requirement for dynamism. Because it seems to me like if you consider something in the distant past, say, something else in the distant future, entirely disconnected from me and anyone that I, at least presently care about. But I suppose that, like, if you ask me, would I prefer that some horrible event happened 1,000 years in the past or 1,000 years in the future, all else equal? I mean, I guess, I don't know. It seems to me about the same. I don't know why I would significantly care more about the one 1,000 years in the future than the 1,000 years in the past. But that seems to suggest that, if that's correct, at least for me, it seems to suggest that the asymmetry is not universal. It's maybe more commonly tied to other things, especially about myself and the other things that I happen to care about. There's important asymmetries there, but not across the board. And this also gets me into thinking some things about, I like a lot of the decision theory stuff, and I'm perfectly fine even deliberating over the past if I think that my present actions are correlated in the right way with the past. It's just that I don't think we'd end up doing that, either because we don't expect there to be those correlations, or we know more about the past, or we don't care about the past, yada, yada, yada. But those are just contingent asymmetries and not something that would roll that out altogether. But anyway, that seems to me, I'm just not convinced that there's anything more or anything substantial to this sort of time biased kind of based argument, and partly for the reasons that I said. But what do you think about the way that I phrase things?
Yes. So I agree. So I certainly think that all of those things that you talk about, the kind of epistemic asymmetry, the kind of causal asymmetry, I think all of these are things that obviously the block theorists can help themselves to, and which are very plausible explanations for, I'm not sure about temporal relief. I mean, that's a more complicated case, but yeah, in terms of temporal preferences, and various people have, offered various bits and combinations of these as explanations. So I don't find the argument terribly compelling either. I guess if I were a dynamist, what I might try and push on is the difference between explaining and grounding as normatively correct. So if I were a dynamist, I might try and respond to you with, yes, notice that the story you just told about kind of causal asymmetries and so forth, that's the kind of story you find, like going back, kind of starting with Hume, and then we get it through, Paul Horwich and a bunch of people, and then Heather Dyke, Dyke and McLaurin have a paper that kind of take this up, and then Callender and Sulla. And if I were a dynamist, I might say something like, and notice that none of those people arguably think that makes those attitudes the right ones to have, right? It's in those cases, it's offered as an explanation for why we do, but it's more in the spirit of a kind of debunking explanation, I think. Now, it's not obvious that it has to be a debunking explanation, but if I were a dynamist, I might say, look, you can kind of explain why we have these things, but like what I wanted was not just a psychological explanation. I wanted some way that the world is, which grounds that being the right way to be. And you've just given me a kind of explanation of why we are the way we are, which doesn't actually ground the reasonableness. Now, it's not obvious to me that that's right. But that is a way they could try and respond there, which is, there's a big difference between kind of normativity and kind of psychological explanation. I'm not sure that is what they're going to say, but that's certainly a way they could go. So I guess I think it's nice. So I think that some complicated explanation that includes all those kinds of things is going to be the right explanation of why we as evolved creatures have these kind of preferences. I think maybe even more nuance will be needed in there, but something in that vicinity is surely going to be right. I think there might still be ideally a little bit more work to do in responding to their argument, just because I think it would be nice if we could also show that people's normative judgments actually come apart from those kinds of dynamical facts, because then we can really respond to something, an argument that's packaged as, well, you've just debunked that phenomenon. Basically, you've shown, block theorists, that if the block theory is right, that we have a bunch of attitudes we ought not have. You've explained them, but like you've left, So I'm hoping that some of the book tries to go a bit beyond that, which is not to say I'm committed to thinking that those temporal preferences are in fact the right ones to have. I think it's very controversial whether you should prefer, pains to be in the past rather than the future. And particularly when we start asking not just about the same amount of pain, but like the question, should you prefer, or is it reasonable to prefer lots more pain over lots less pain if it's in the past rather than the future? I think it's way less obvious to me that it's reasonable to prefer 10 times the amount of pain over one time the amount of pain, just if that pain is past versus future. But I would like to put the block theorist in a position where if she thinks, or he thinks, that those preferences are reasonable, she can offer some account of their reasonableness, which doesn't privilege a dynamical view. I would also like to leave the block theorist with the possibility of saying, look, here's an explanation for why we have those preferences, but boy, they are not reasonable, because it is not reasonable to prefer 10 times the amount of pain over, 10 times less the amount of pain. Like that's bad shit, right? So I don't want to take a stance on the normative facts, but I do want to try and suggest that even if I grant to my opponent that they are reasonable, the block theorist can accommodate the reasonability, not merely the explanatoriness of them. And that's kind of the project there.
No, yeah, that's a very good point. Because I could see people saying something like, look, yeah, as you say, maybe you could explain why we would have the sort of psychology that would prefer that 10-hour surgery be in our past than a 1-hour surgery be in our future, even though, wait a minute, but overall, like, obviously it's more pain with having the 10-hour one. Why is it? Anyway, if we explain that away, okay, that's one thing. If we explain why we have that attitude, that's one thing, but it's another thing to say, well, I think a lot of people want to say, no, it really genuinely would be worse for us to have a 1-hour surgery in our future than a 10-hour surgery in our past. But that, right, if you want to say that that's not actually the case, it's not genuinely worse for us, then, well, I think, people are going to have some trouble giving up those intuitive normative judgments. And maybe you could either say, no, there's a sense in which that is a correct normative judgment, but then you have a story to give there. Or it is a sort of debunking argument, and say, no, actually, that's not correct, and here's why you've come to the incorrect belief about it. But I just more generally, though, in this case and others, one worry that I can imagine, well, no, that's a bit weak, but people sometimes do have about some of these responses to presentist views, some of these objections to presentist views, is that it looks like, I don't know, a sort of skeptical argument. Like you can imagine someone saying, oh, you don't think you're a brain in a vat, but like, here's how I can explain away all your feelings of not being a brain in a vat. And we could accommodate all of that here on the brain in a vat theory. But and some people might say, like, okay, maybe you can accommodate all of my experiences and judgments and attitudes and whatever on the block theory. But that, to me, it really seems, in some sense, and I guess we don't have to go back to what it seems to people issue, but it would seem like an analogously skeptical conclusion to reject that picture of time. So anyway, I guess that's revisiting some of the earlier issues, but like, what do you think about this comparison of the arguments here against some of the presentist beliefs, whether it be the normative stuff or something else, and a sort of skeptical argument?
Yeah, so I guess I think I think you're right that it will partly depend on what you make of the early bit of the book about whether it really does seem as though time passes. Because if it really does seem like that, then yeah, it seems like maybe you're merely explaining away these other things, and there's still something left that's puzzling. It might also depend a bit on, I guess, what your priors are for either of these views. So I guess what's really weird about the brain in the vat case is that you might say, okay, let me grant that you can explain that things will seem just like this if I am a brain in the vat. Maybe what seems unsatisfying about that is that you have much higher credence that, I mean, let's suppose, or whether it's right or not, you have much higher credence that you are not a brain in the vat than you are. Then it seems like the right place to come to is something like, well, look, all your arguments mean that I can't completely rule out that I'm a brain in the vat, because you've shown that things would still sort of seem like this. But still, you haven't really, and that's not doing no work, but you haven't really moved the needle, because like my credence was already very high that I'm not a brain in the vat. So all you've done is show that that's sort of consistent with how things seem, or I can't rule it out a priori or something. And so you might think the same in the temporal case. That would only be true if your if your independent priors for the world being dynamical versus a block were like really heavily in favor of it being dynamical. And so then all you've done is sort of show that the appearances can be accommodated within a block view. And then the right thing to say might be, yeah, but I'm still a dynamist. All you've shown is that, yeah, things might be like this even if I were in a block view. And the book definitely does not tell you anything about what your priors should be. Because I guess, well, there's priors and then there's priors on the basis of all of the other kind of metaphysical arguments. And so I suppose I take myself to sort of be talking to people who think that there are independent other reasons to be a block theorist that arise from kind of, best science and so forth. So I'm imagining that there's somebody who thinks, yeah, look, there's a lot that's appealing about the block view. It fits very nicely in with a kind of, general relativistic view about our world. But I had these kind of worries that arose about how to meld people's experiences onto the nature of our world being a block. So this book is sort of targeted more at that person. I think you're right that if you come to the book just being certain that our world is dynamical, but not on the basis of these kind of seemings, then what should you take away from this? Well, maybe at most you should take away, well, here's a kind of weird thing. I still think our world is dynamical, but I kind of grant that maybe it would seem like this, even if it weren't. I guess that's not nothing to it. I mean, it has kind of, it's resolved certain sorts of objections to block view, but yeah, it doesn't, certainly the book on its own does not decisively show that you shouldn't be a dynamist. Doesn't sort of set out to do that. I mean, that's a big job. I'm not even sure I know how to do that job actually, because it's hard to convince people who have an alternative view that they have the wrong view. But this book won't do that. It really is much narrower in scope. It's not going to convince people who are sure that dynamism is true that they're wrong about that. At best, it might suggest that if your only reason to be a dynamist was that you were persuaded by by a move that takes you from the nature of your experience to the nature of the world, then you should be more worried about the inference. You should be thinking, wait, I'm not sure that that is correct. If that's all, and it's targeted at block theorists who are worried about how to accommodate experience, those are really the target. In terms of dialectically moving people around, those are the targets. Of course, one hopes that other people read the book as well, but I don't expect them to be convinced, right? Because they have a bunch of other reasons to be, say, a dynamist. Still, if you can move people at all, that's always a happy, I feel like that's as good as you can do in philosophy, is to like change one person's mind. Like if Bill emails and he's like, yes, you changed my mind, I'll be like, yes, thank you, Bill. I have done well.
No, yeah, that's good. I do sort of get that impression that at least some of the people who favor the dynamical views would say, well, okay, they're not as sure of a dynamical view as they are of like other non-skeptical theses, like that they're not brains and fats and so on. But like they're still kind of find that very intuitive and plausible that they're not a part of a block universe. But yeah, I mean, perhaps you could undermine that a little bit, or maybe question whether that is the actual content of their intuitions, and part of the, I guess, I take it the part of the book is actually aimed at undermining that thought anyway.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to touch on something else quickly, because, well, I found it's sort of interesting. In Balaguer's book, he doesn't really focus at all on probably the main argument for presentism, which has to do with, I would think, the stuff regarding the sensation of temporal passage. And in your book, you don't really focus much on arguably what is the main argument for the block universe view, which is going to be from physics and special relativity. We don't need to necessarily get into the motivation there, but could you talk a little bit about why you don't focus on that in this book?
Yeah, I mean, I guess partly because I'm predominantly interested in this move from kind of experiential stuff to inference about the way the world is, then that's not doesn't sort of obviously lend itself to that. I guess also because I'm not sure there's much more to be said there. So there are what I take to be quite powerful arguments that suggest that on the basis of best science, the better fitting model is a kind of block view. But I think those arguments I mean, arguments have been kind of well made on both sides, and I think they are no longer very dialectically forceful in the sense that block theorists offer kind of arguments that appeal to various facts about general and special relativity, and then there are that cause problems for dynamical theories, and then there are going to be a bunch of sort of responses from dynamical theorists. And I think in some sense, and then you know, block theorists can then respond to the responses. But in a way, things end up sort of at a stalemate, because the block theorist says, look, general and special relativity do not posit as part of that theory that there is any kind of privileged, correct foliation of space-time into kind of temporal slices, if you will. And you, dynamist, you require this. You require that we can kind of foliate temporality in that, or the universe in that way, because you think that there are really facts about which things are present. And so you must think that there's a fact about, like, for any two events, whether they both really are simultaneous or not, because after all, you think there's a fact about whether they really are both, like, present at the same time, as it were. So you require that there is this kind of preferred foliation, and our best science fails to posit that. So that's how the dispute sort of begins, and then invariably dynamists will say something like, yeah, look, best science does not posit that there is such a foliation, but it's not inconsistent with there being one, right? So we can imagine that there is a fact about which things really are present, but it's just sort of that fact is opaque to us. It doesn't show up in our best physics, and it doesn't make an empirical difference to the nature of the world. You can't figure out which things really, like what the preferred foliation really is. Same, you know, laws obtain all these various foliations. But there's other good reasons metaphysically to posit that there is such a thing, and it is not inconsistent with our best physics. And then at that point, there's sort of a stalemate, because I guess maybe it gets you into other methodological issues about, like, how to best prosecute metaphysics. But it's hard to see how to make any inroads, because the block theorist is going to agree with what that dynamist just said, right? The block theorist should say, yeah, you're right. The best science does not decisively tell us that there cannot be such a foliation. It just tells us that there's no kind of empirically grounded way to determine what it is, if there is such a thing. And mostly best science is not going to posit things that are kind of empirically undetectable and make no difference. But, like, you know, you're in the business of metaphysics, so of course you may be positing things that are like that. And so I feel like that dispute has kind of, in a way, run its course, because it's hard to see how to move anybody. The block theorist just thinks should concede that the best science doesn't rule out dynamism in the way that maybe early on in the dispute people like Putnam thought maybe it decisively did. So they should concede that dynamism is not, like, flat out inconsistent with the best science. On the other hand, they should definitely say, dude, your view is super weird, right? Like, it's not a natural fit, because you're positing this thing that absolutely does not turn up in our best physics. And that is all they can say. That's not going to, it seems, does not bring the dynamist around, because the dynamist, you know, frequently will say, yeah, sure, but we often, like, we can posit things that are not in our best science, that are not inconsistent with it. And nothing that anyone says at that point moves anyone else in this dispute. And there's definitely nothing I can bring to the table to kind of change that. I think the facts are now kind of out there about what's consistent with what you can do in the face of facts about general and special relativity. So I didn't think that that's a very useful place to kind of intercede in the literature, just because of that. And so I think that people who take that science seriously and think you shouldn't be positing things that are sort of over and above what's in the science are already motivated towards a block view. And what I can do for them is try and show how that view is not inconsistent with our ordinary first personal experience of the world. And that seems like a nice gift to give to people who kind of want to embrace the block, possibly partly in virtue of taking seriously these kinds of reasons from science.
Right. I did want to mention Balaguer in his book actually takes even more a strange approach than he doesn't even think that we need to posit preferred foliation. Rather, he wants to say, I'm not going to give all the details here. I find it kind of strange, but the idea is something like he adopts a sort of relativized presentism where, in some sense, what exists is relative to frame or something like that.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right,
I'm
so
not
that's
sure
enough.
how, but nevertheless, it's supposed to be a presentist friendly. But
Yeah.
he tries to make some view that's compatible with special relativity as standardly assumed without a preferred foliation. I had some concerns for that. I'm not sure that it ultimately works, but he tried to make some view like that work.
Right.
And maybe
Yeah,
that's
so
another way to go.
That's going to be your other option if you don't go with a preferred frame is to just relativize your dynamism in some way to a frame of reference, or sometimes people do it to a point, or whatever. So that is definitely a way forward. My general worry with those kind of strategies is that it's not completely clear what aspect of dynamism is preserved there. But yeah, that discussion will certainly take us far afield. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I was sort of worrying that either this might collapse into some sort of non-presentist view, maybe even eternalism, or, I mean, if things only exist in a frame relative sense, in what sense do they exist impliciter? I'm not sure how it makes. Yeah. So,
it's a puzzling. Yeah,
the
those
view seems
relativized. Yeah,
puzzling.
they're puzzling.
Yeah.
I share your general puzzlement that it's hard to conceptually get your head around, and it's hard to get one's head around what it means for things to exist relative to a frame, right? Like what is that? Which is, I guess, why when Putnam set that argument out originally, he's like, well, obviously, if this thing exists relative to, from the perspective of this frame, and this other thing exists from the perspective of this other frame, then those things exist, right? He didn't even, that's how the argument was originally went against sort of dynamical views. And he didn't even consider the thought, which some people have certainly taken up since, which is that existence is kind of relative to a frame. Because I imagine he just thought, what the heck would that be, right? That's a wild view about existence. It's an interesting area to pursue for the dynamist. But I do think it also has has additional sorts of challenges of exactly this kind. Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Now, we should wrap up in a little bit, but I did want to quickly cover a couple of things from chapter 8, if that's all right. Some of the motivations in favor or positive arguments for the block view. And one of them you mentioned has to do with parsimony considerations. I mean, do you want to sort of briefly mention what you talk about there?
When you said that, I was like, wait, what did you say in chapter 8? Do I talk about, are these parsimony considerations that arise when you're comparing sort of like eternalism with something like presentism, where you have all these complicated apparatus that you need? Yeah. So, I mean, I guess one just very straightforward way of putting that is just that, look, if you have I sort of think of the block universe as being a very simple view. Like, it's just the view that you have this one big loaf, and there's lots of different perspectives within the loaf. There's lots of kind of conceptual ways of carving it up. And the loaf is just all of the things that are ever the case. They make true, bits of the loaf make true all of the things that you ever want to say about what's happening elsewhere in the loaf, right? So in this sense, it seems like it's super straightforward. It's just a big, hunk of bread that's connected by other bits of bread, and that has different, different bits of the loaf might be different in various places, and that's the full story to tell. Whereas once you start importing dynamism, dynamical views become much more complicated quite quickly, because, of course, you've got to capture the sense in which the whole shebang is in some way changing, either by growing new slices or by your slice changing or something. But you've also got, because you don't have access to the whole block anymore, like the whole loaf of bread, you've got all these complicated things you have to do to make sense of things like just, very standard claims about what was the case. So, I mean, presentists have the hardest time because they have this very minimal ontology. And, people often try and sell presentism as being very folk friendly and as being very parsimonious because, like, you don't have all this past stuff. Like, there are no dinosaurs on your list of things that exist. But, there is something very simple and elegant about just a whole block that contains dinosaurs and which makes true everything, all of the facts about dinosaurs. And if you're a presentist, you have to try and ape all of the things that the block theorist just does by having a loaf of bread, but by building it all into the one slice that does exist. And this results in all sorts of complicated things that different presentists do. But, presentists want to be able to say things like, Doris the dinosaur ate, Billy the dinosaur back at, whatever time it was. But this all becomes very difficult because, like, Doris and Billy don't exist and they don't exist implicita. What on earth can make that true? Well, it's not really clear because you might expect claims about dinosaurs to be made true by dinosaurs because, like, that's what they're about. But, like, presentists don't have any more dinosaurs. But they don't want to say that it's not true. They certainly don't want to say that, like, what happened yesterday, that there are not truths about yesterday and so forth. So they have to import some kind of complicated edifice in order to preserve everything that the block universe theorists can just say straightforwardly, but without having the block there. And that just commits you to all sorts of complicated things like, special primitive truths or special truths that are like properties of the whole universe at a time that kind of point towards stuff that doesn't exist, or hexaides of things that, like, hang around after they're gone, but somehow, serve as truth bearers for claims about that thing. And, like, dude, like, you sort of sell your view as being folk friendly and obvious and parsimonious and stuff. But, like, what is this floating hexaide? Like, we've got Aristotle's hexaide, like, floating around here, making true all these claims about him. And, it pops into existence when he does, and then it stays around afterwards. Like, that does not strike me as very simple, does not strike me as at all folk friendly. Like, if you ask the folk about these things, like, is Aristotle's got some kind of little internal hexaide floating around now that makes claims true about him, they'd be like, what the heck is a hexaide, right? So I think presentists get very, like, obviously they want to preserve all those truths, and rightly so, and so they try and they kind of come up with an edifice for doing that. And of course you can do that, right? So they're smart people. There's a way that they can recapture all those truths. But I do think that they sometimes lose track of the fact that the resulting theory is not this elegant, simple, folk-friendly thing anymore. It's quite the unwieldy, you've traded in very standard things like dinosaurs, which, like, they're just like concrete dies that we can all understand, for complicated, weird present stuff like hexaides or property, past pointing properties of the world, or primitive truths, or truths that have no truth makers. And it's not clear to me that this is a sensible trade, and it's not clear to me that view should be sold and marketed. I feel like it's kind of false advertising, right? And I guess that's one reason why I think something I wanted to say in favor of the block view is, like, look at the elegance. It's just one loaf of bread. Like, that's all you need. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Balaguer's reply to the truthmaker worry, at least for pure past tense and pure future tense claims, is just that, yeah, they're true, but nothing makes them true. That's it. There's nothing that makes them true, but they're just sort of true in some primitive sense.
Yeah, right. And I think that seems kind of, so again, that's a thing you can say. I know it doesn't commit you, I guess, to weird truth makers, but it does seem kind of odd. Like, you might ask the question, like, why is that? Why is it that things that are true of the present, like, if you ask me, is Lily the Labradoodle, like, asleep on the sofa, and I say yes, and that's true, the natural thing is to suppose that it's been made true by an actual flesh and blood dog on an actual flesh and blood sofa. And in fact, if I were to tell you that that's true, but there is no dog that is Lily, and there is no sofa that she's on, but it's just primitively true, you'd be like, well, what is this lady, like, what did she eat this morning that made that seem like a plausible thing? It's, I find it quite difficult to understand why in the present moment we search for, and think we should search for, very regular kinds of truth makers, but somehow when we're talking about past and future, that no longer becomes a thing. And if there are just primitive truths, why is truth constrained at all, I guess, is another thought, right? So if truths are not made true by something, then why is it not true that, yesterday a giant flying pink elephant flew over Sydney, right? So no, that's not true. Some other bunch of things is true, but if nothing makes anything true, why are some things? Like, where does this primitiveness get its oomph from? I'm sure there's a story to be told there, but again, it still seems much less straightforward than an easy kind of block story.
Right. He tries to tell a story and then maybe motivate it with some other examples, like with modal truths. Maybe he thinks there's something similar to be said there. But it is a bit of a mystery. Like, okay, we want to say it's true that dinosaurs existed, although nothing makes that true. It's false that, say, unicorns existed, but nothing makes that false. Right. And there's just kind of no further explanation for why the first one was true and the second one was false. And then for other claims that aren't pure past claims or future claims in this way, but that seem to involve ontological commitment to things, which if they exist in the past or the future, one of the examples he considers is Prince William is a direct descendant of William the Conqueror. Well, that seems to imply some sort of relation between two individuals, but strictly speaking on presentism, although Prince William exists, William the Conqueror does not. And so he thinks that strictly speaking, that is just false, right? Because it requires these two individuals to satisfy this relation, but not both of those individuals exist, so the relation isn't satisfied. But he does want to say that in some practical sense it's true, because it would have been true at an eternalist world at which the pure past tense claims had all been true. And so he has some story to tell about how in some sense it's like for all practical purposes true, but strictly speaking false. And he wants to actually extend the for all practical purposes truth to a lot of our temporal discourse as well. But anyway, it's an interesting project. I found certain things implausible there, but that's one way that you might go, I think.
Yeah. So look, that's another quite distinctive Balaguer route, which is less often pursued, which is this kind of fictionalist approach, which of course is known for in the positive maths. That's another differently complicated, right? So I guess there's one bunch of people who are trying to find truth makers, and they end up positing weird and wonderful things that exist in the present. Then you've got Balaguer, who's going to say that a certain bunch of claims are either primitively true or they're just false, but they're kind of true in some kind of eternalist fiction. But it does seem like all of these things share something, which is that they are they're complicated in some kind of way, or you've got some kind of complicated ideology going on here. And so I think it's just worth drawing attention. I guess that, the thought in chapter 8 is just worth drawing attention to that, because people sort of act as if the block universe view is particularly counterintuitive or, flies in the face of the ways we normally think about the world. And perhaps in some ways it does, but I think it's easy when you talk to someone on the street to simply present them with two options. One is like there's presentism where there aren't any dinosaurs, and there's a block universe where there are, and to think, oh well, then they tend to think that the presentist model is more intuitive or something, and that might well be the case. But of course, that's not the full story. I mean, they're just comparing, is it more intuitive that there are dinosaurs or not? Even if we were to grant that it's more intuitive that there aren't, and I think that that's something you could dispute. But even if we do, you need to go on to explain, well, okay, mate, now notice that because there aren't any dinosaurs, it's going to be really hard to make sense of what it is for there to be truths about there. Now, suppose I tell you, well, we're going to have to, actually all these claims are false, but they're true in some fiction. Or I tell you that they're true, but it's just primitively true and nothing makes them true. Or I tell you that there's the hexaid of those dinosaurs floating around that makes it true. And it's no longer so clear that is the kind of intuitive view. And it's important to sort of make that clear, because nobody's asking people those questions when they're kind of wondering what's intuitive, right? No one's like, oh, do you think that secretly there are floating hexaides? Not floating. But so that's the general thought there, is to compare like for like.
Right, fair. And okay, so maybe if you could sort of sum up, what do you think the main conclusions to draw from this book are regarding time?
So I guess what I hope to have argued is something pretty narrow, which is just, look, there's no easy move from claims about the way the world seems to us or the way we believe it to be or the kinds of temporal attitudes we have to the conclusion that we have a reason to think that time really is dynamical. And that's either because the world really doesn't seem to us to be the way that we might have thought or that dynamists have suggested it is, or it's because even when the world really does seem the way that they say in terms of, beliefs or attitudes or whatever, it being that way is not best explained by positive dynamism, and it's not, having the attitudes that we do have is not best normatively grounded in there being dynamism. So there might be good reasons to be a dynamist that are completely distinct from any of these kinds of considerations that appeal to our sort of lived experience. I certainly grant that. So, and dynamism might be true for all that I've said, but the claim is just, there's not a powerful argument to that conclusion based on any of these kinds of experiential sort of claims.
Good, yeah. Fair enough. And okay, I do normally end with a more general meta-philosophical question. So I'll give that, I want to see what you think. What do you think is the value of philosophy? Why is philosophy worth doing, perhaps to you or more generally? I know this is a big question. Maybe if you have a couple of thoughts, that'd be fine.
Well, I guess partly it's worth doing because we want to know what the world is like in whatever way we're kind of interested in. Like, we want to know what it's like temporally, we want to know what it's like morally, we want to know all those kinds of things. And I think philosophy is one important route, not the only, not as a standalone, but like alongside other disciplines. It's an important route to figuring out what the world is like. But also to figuring out sort of what our connection to the world is. So I guess we don't always want to just be looking out and sort of doing an inventory of everything that's around us. It's not there's a tree and there's a telegraph pole and there's a door. Maybe we do want that and we want to see how those things are connected, but we also want to see where our place in that world is, either sort of morally or experientially or perspectively. And I think philosophy is also an important sort of tool for doing that. And actually that's part of what's motivating this book, I guess, is the trying to figure out like what is the connection between lived experience and perspectival experience and so forth, and what we should think about the world. And I guess philosophy is, I take it, kind of well placed to try and be answering those questions, which are not always questions that people are asking and answering elsewhere, right? So chemists are kind of interested in like, what is the chemical structure of stuff? And physicists are mostly interested in like, what's the physical nature of stuff? And I take it to be sort of uniquely, well, maybe not completely uniquely, because you might think sociology and psychology are obviously more interested in us as individuals and societies, but nevertheless, it's an important part of philosophy to try and think about our connections to what the world is like, and to think about the kind of epistemic connections as well. Like how do we figure out what the world is like given the kinds of creatures we are and the places that we find ourselves?
Yeah, fair enough. I definitely agree with that. There's a lot of not necessarily uniquely philosophical questions and uniquely philosophical methods, but things that are associated with and philosophy is helpful to explore that we're just interested in, it seems to me. And some of them are worth exploring for other means or for their own sake. Yeah. But yeah, good. So I'll leave links to where people can find the book. We didn't explore everything in the book, so there's still a lot of other things to explore, especially as it relates to stuff in, I think, chapter 5 and chapter 7 and some other stuff in chapter 8 and some of the early stuff in the book. There's a lot of content in this book that if people found this this interesting, they may want to check out the book when it's available. But yeah, anyways, thanks so much for coming on, Professor Miller, and taking my questions and writing this book. It's been really great having you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me, and great discussion.